Leah, welcome into the back room.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk with you about your book. We're going to talk about your book, I promise. We're going to discuss it shortly. But first, I just want to start with a few other things. There was a couple of major events that occurred last Saturday that I want to get your opinion on. The massive No Kings protests and what I call Donald Trump's tiny peen parade. What did you take away from both of those?
I was really encouraged by the No Kings protest. I think the investment of that many people signaling their dissatisfaction and concern with what the administration is doing is so necessary to counteract this false narrative that the Trump administration had this huge mandate and continues to have this huge mandate to do the various things that they are doing. I also think it enables Democratic politicians to feel emboldened to push back more against the Trump administration when they see that many people are behind them. The military parade was gross. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and a huge failure,
Yes.
according to most estimates. Whenever I need a little jolt, I just go and watch the clips of the tanks going by and the empty
The
bleachers. It
empty,
just
yes.
makes me so happy.
Salve
But
for the soul.
yeah, so let's talk about the underlying issue here, for the most part, which is Trump's push towards autocracy and what's going on in LA. As we all know, he's federalized the National Guard without the request or the consent of Governor Gavin Newsom. Newsom sued. And last night, a panel of 3 judges of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, 2 Trump appointees, 1 Biden appointee, gave Trump a huge victory. Newsom apparently can ask for the case to go to a larger 11-judge panel of the court. And although Trump won, the courts didn't really fully agree with his claims. And then there's also going to be a hearing today by the district court judge in the case, Charles Breyer, he of the famous supermarket ice cream family. Let's not forget that. And the judge is going to consider a request by Newsom for a longer term block of the Guard and the Marines. But it's all so confusing. Can you help us unpack this?
Yes. So the Ninth Circuit put on hold Judge Breyer's order that had directed the president to return control of the California National Guard to Governor Newsom. And even though Judge Breyer is holding this hearing today about whether to grant a preliminary injunction, the fact that the Court of Appeals, that is kind of his boss and oversees him, told him that they thought the president had likely lawfully deployed and federalized the California National Guard is sure to color what Judge Breyer will do in that proceeding. They also told him our assessment, our view of the law is that courts have to give the president significant deference when they are determining whether the statutory predicates for federalizing the National Guard have been met. Unfortunately, the president is taking this as a huge victory and a green light, I think, to deploy National Guard and military elsewhere, because after the Ninth Circuit issued that opinion, he posted on Truth Social, as one does, that he, in a way that suggested he was maybe considering deploying the National Guard elsewhere. And that is super concerning. He suggested if our cities and our people need protection, we are the ones to give it to them and, get the job done. This is a great decision for our country. And so it doesn't seem like in his mind this is limited to California. And I think that should concern everyone.
Yeah. And, I was listening to someone on MSNBC, I think this morning, saying like, well, if he tries to pull that stuff in New York, man, there's going to be huge protests and maybe even some violence. And someone else said, that's what he wants, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes, because what the court did is they identified 2 incidents, of vandalism of federal property and said, because you can point to, again, 2 incidents, that justifies your ability to call up 4,000 California National Guardsmen and essentially yank control of law enforcement from the state and local police and deprive the state of use of the National Guard for other reasons. So I agree. He wants the provocation. He wants the confrontation as cover to exercise more force and deploy more federal military throughout the country.
And, one of the interesting things to me about this ruling is that the Ninth Circuit, which Trump used to bash as being this shameless tool of the left, isn't so left anymore, is it?
No, there was really a radical transformation of the Ninth Circuit during the first Trump administration. He was able to appoint several judges to that court. And also, that court was never that liberal. There were a small number of judges who happened to be, more liberal than the average federal judge was. But Democrats are not appointing people who are even a thousandth as left as
Right.
Republicans appointees are right. I mean, you had a Biden nominee join this decision, staying the lower court order.
And then there was another significant ruling yesterday. A federal judge in Rhode Island ruled that it's unconstitutional for Trump to condition transportation funding for states based on whether or not they cooperate with his federal immigration policies. How significant and consequential is this ruling?
I think that ruling is significant because the Trump administration has been trying to use the power of the purse and their control over federal funds to browbeat and coerce states and localities to do their bidding. And this decision underscores, look, you can only take away those funds that are actually related to the program you are trying to implement. And so I think this should hopefully serve as a check on some of their other efforts in other domains as well.
So before we get to the book, I just want to say I'm a big fan of your podcast.
Thank you.
I love what you guys do. You co-host with Kate Shaw and Melissa Murray, the popular crooked media podcast, Strict Scrutiny. Its description says it's hosted by, quote, three badass constitutional law professors. I love badasses. I consider myself a badass. Why are you guys badasses?
I think we know a lot of law, and so we are able to digest what is happening in the courts and in politics pretty quickly and then distill it for listeners in order to help people stay informed. And we do it with a measure of snark and irreverence that makes it go down easier.
And great humor, I should say. And I think you started the podcast in 2019.
That's right. We started it basically right after Justice Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed because it felt like people at the time didn't really realize how significant a shift in the Supreme Court that appointment was about to create.
And so that makes you guys are real pioneers in this medium. What would you say are the most significant changes in podcasting since then?
One is having to also post video. I personally like the old days of
Hair and makeup.
podcasting where I never had to be camera ready. That was a big part of the appeal.
I know, me too. Me too. I spent hours in hair and makeup this morning.
So that's definitely one of the big changes. And second is, I think, the number of people participating in that space. The number of podcasts has really exploded, and I think that has changed the market as well.
Yeah, and we saw in the last election that podcasting became this really important tool, unfortunately used more effectively by Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. But I think we're going to see even more of that going forward. All right, so let's talk about the book. It's called Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Great title. What made you decide to write this book, which is a pretty scathing indictment of the nation's highest court?
I think in a lot of ways, it started back when I was clerking at the Supreme Court. So I was clerking at the court at the time they heard the big constitutional challenge to the Affordable Care Act, and the court came within one vote of striking down that entire law. I think by skewing the court's previous precedent and also coming up with this bogeyman that the real threat to liberty was somehow the prospect that the federal government would make you buy or eat broccoli. So ever since my time at the court, I had thought this is an institution that is on the precipice of disaster, whereas too many people looked at the outcome and said, okay, the law mostly stood. Things are all well and good. There's this moderate institutionalist center. And it felt like, again, after the Kavanaugh appointment, people were not appreciating the risk to Roe versus Wade. Even after the court heard oral argument about whether to overrule Roe versus Wade, people still were telling themselves they're not going to do it. And then after they did so, there was this moment of focus and outcry on the Supreme Court. But I just worry that has receded and people have reverted to this sense and hope that the Supreme Court is good and will save us. And I wanted to socialize people in a very different picture of the court.
So let's talk about the grievance part. Trump, as we know, is the victim in chief. And victimhood is literally the blood that runs through Republicans' veins. How has the politics of grievance shaped this Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I think it is pretty easy to see that idea of conservative grievance in electoral politics. I mean, Donald Trump basically stands up and says it wherever. But I think you can see the same idea in the law that the Republican justices are fashioning across a range of areas where they somehow always become fixated on the idea that some group that is really affiliated with the modern Republican Party is the real victim in the matter they are assessing. So when it comes to LGBT equality, the victims are not the gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender individuals who are having their rights threatened. It is instead the people who object to LGBT equality, whose views have fallen out of fashion in the area of voting rights. The victims are not Black people, voters of color, language minorities who are oftentimes burdened and prevented from voting by restrictive voting laws. The real victims are instead the white conservatives or the Republican-led states who are forced to ensure that those voters are represented in campaign finance. You know, the victims are not all of America, whose elections are now dominated by a few mega rich individuals. The victims are those mega rich individuals when laws try to restrict their ability to spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections. And so it's this tendency to invert who has power and who is the victim that I think is an important through line in what the Republican justices are doing in so many different areas of law.
Yeah, the poor billionaires.
Oh, yeah.
Jeez,
Weep
they
for
have it
them.
so rough.
They can wipe
Um,
away their tears with dollar bills.
$100 bills.
Yeah.
And what about the bad vibes? Speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so bad vibes is really the bigger category that is meant to describe the feelings and political talking points and general atmosphere of the Republican Party that they are using to fashion the law and sometimes just to declare to be the law. And one of those bad vibes, I think really the biggest bad vibe, is this idea of conservative grievance. But you can see there are other feelings kind of imprinted and stamped onto the law elsewhere. So just to take an example, when the justices blew up Joe Biden's effort to provide student debt relief to millions of Americans, the Republican justices declared they didn't have to follow their usual rules of statutory interpretation. Why? Because student debt relief generated personal and emotionally charged debates. Like they are literally using their feelings and the feelings of Republican politicians as an opt out of law card.
So crazy when you just think about it in those
Yeah.
terms. And what are some of the fringe theories that have infiltrated the Roberts Court?
Yeah, so I'll just name one, which I think has become especially significant as of late, and that's the unitary executive theory. That idea was really pushed during the Reagan administration as a way of expanding presidential power. It maintains that the president and the president alone possesses all of the executive power and therefore has to control everyone in the executive branch, and also that the executive power gives the president power to do some things that aren't even specifically listed in the Constitution. That was one of the key ideas behind the court's egregious immunity decision from last summer, where they declared the president is basically above the law when it comes to investigations and prosecutions, the removal of officers, and other matters. And so that's a very fringe theory that, again, was really pushed during the Reagan years. The Supreme Court has never embraced it by a majority until, boom, all of a sudden you have a supermajority of right-wing justices and a Republican president, and then all of a sudden, unitary executive theory is basically the law.
You know, what's so troubling to me is that ever since we're little kids, we hear three co-equal branches of government. Then when you start to analyze the unitary executive theory, you can't give the president more power unless there's on some level diminishment of the power of Congress and the courts. Yet we seem to be moving quite rapidly towards more of that. And I don't understand that. What is in the interest of Congress and the courts to give more power to the president?
So I think the story over the last few decades has been one of Congress being willing to defer or authorize the president to make determinations, in part because, emergencies arise in part because we had assumed that we would never elect the bad man as president. And so we could trust presidents to exercise the kind of judgment and make decisions based on important norms that have always structured, the exercise of political power in the United States. But when you put someone in that office who fundamentally does not believe in law or democracy and is an aspiring autocrat, then all of a sudden, all of those delegations of power become so extraordinary and so subject to abuse. And the Trump administration, I think, has literally been combing the US code, trying to find every single law that gives the president any power and exercising the maximum extent of their authority. You add to that the supermajority Republican controlled court and the Republican controlled court that existed even before them, slowly ceding more power to the president, again, based on the Republican Party's vision of a strong executive. And I think that has enabled a lot of what we are seeing today.
Yeah, I think you really just hit the nail on the head with something. Another thing we learn as kids is that the founding fathers were so brilliant. Look what they created, right? But what you just said is really the point, that they never prepared for a madman. They never prepared for a dictator wannabe. We broke off from a king and a monarchy, and they never, in their wildest imaginations, could prepare us for that again within the boundaries of our own borders. And so that's where we're at today. It's just this place where founding fathers weren't so smart, were they?
They weren't. They certainly did not contemplate many of the possibilities we face today. They also created an imperfect system of government. You look at the system of representation in the Senate, for example, that is one of, I think, the very important mechanisms for minority rule in the United States, since we often now have a majority of senators who represent significantly less than a majority of the country. But I guess I would also say is the founders understood that one of the important checks on our government was always going to be the character of the leaders and the civic virtue of the people. And I think that those mechanisms broke down. And I also think that no matter how you design a perfect system of government, if you put someone who fundamentally does not believe in legal constraint or liberal constitutional democracy in one of the most significant, if not the most significant positions of authority, no system of law is going to be able to perfectly prevent all of the damage that is possible when you do that.
Yeah, it's chilling. So the Supreme Court has lost whatever prestige or luster it's had in the past. It's lost the trust and the respect of the people, and it's been shrouded in controversy and conflicts of interest and scandal. How did we get to this point?
I think the story is in part about the decline of our institutions and the decline of the Republican Party. As we were talking about, the Senate now allows a majority of senators who don't represent a majority of the people to confirm justices. So it's no surprise you are getting justices who cater to the views of the increasingly narrow segment of the country that the Republican Party represents. The Electoral College has also allowed the same when it comes to the president. So now you have these two institutions that are no longer as responsive to public opinion being able to appoint justices of the Supreme Court, who were always somewhat insulated from public opinion because of their appointment, because of their tenure. And I think that has exacerbated the democratic deficits of the Supreme Court. And then you add to that the fact that the Republican Party has made a series of choices in which they have leaned into minority rule, given up efforts to try to appeal to a majority of Americans, that both forces them to try to find additional avenues for minority rule and to attack the mechanisms of democracy. It creates an incentive for them to appoint justices who will greenlight their efforts to do so. And it is part of what fueled the rise of the conservative legal movement when they recognized they needed to control the court in order to implement their fringe agenda.
Talk about the court's long game.
So the long game is, I think, in part clear and in part unclear. And I say that in part because I think if you look at how the ecosystem surrounding the Supreme Court works, it's clear the justices are receptive to the changing views of the Republican Party. So I think where the justices go will depend in part on where the Republican Party goes. And I say that, I would just give one example. The Chevron doctrine, under which courts used to defer to administrative agencies' ability to interpret statutes, that used to be a Republican-supported doctrine. That was pushed by the Reagan administration. It was championed by justices like Antonin Scalia. But those same justices then came to abandon it as the Republican Party and conservative legal movement moved away from it. And so what the justices do, I think, will depend on where the core of the political elites of the Republican Party and conservative legal movement go. That being said, they have already indicated what some of their priorities are. I think they are going to continue to chip away at what remains of campaign finance regulation. I think they are going to continue to chip away at the independence, expertise, and neutrality of the administrative state and give the president more and more power to fill the administrative state and executive branch with hacks. I think they are likely to continue to attack voting rights. And those are just three things that I think are already clear, but there are others as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of the court's influence and impact over the last 25 years, I think of Bush v. Gore, Shelby, Citizens United, Dobbs, the immunity ruling. With these cases, the court has dramatically changed politics and healthcare, civil rights, the legal system. It's truly stunning in scope and scale.
It is. And I think that is jarring and alarming, but I also take that as a point of possible encouragement in the sense that if we are trying to build a coalition of people who want to change an institution like the Supreme Court and make it more dramatic, I think one easy way of beginning to do so is to convince people how much the court matters to their lives and the issues they care about. And no matter what those issues are, no matter who you are, the court's decisions are shaping the laws and society you are part of.
Can you speak a little bit about, like, get a little bit more granular in terms of how we as Americans in our daily lives are impacted by these consequential rulings?
Yes. So I would point to the decision just issued on Wednesday, United States versus Scrutiny, in which the Supreme Court said states can go ahead and ban gender affirming care for transgender minors and really trans individuals. That is going to do exactly what their decision in Dobbs did. It is going to create a patchwork where Americans who live in some states have access to health care and Americans who live elsewhere do not. And so they are empowering states and the federal government to come for people's health care. At the same time, they are also making the country less democratic. So this is the institution that invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act that had required states with especially egregious histories of voter discrimination to pre-clear changes to their voting laws. This is the same Supreme Court that allowed mega-rich billionaires to flood our elections with unlimited amounts of money. This is the same Supreme Court that said federal courts cannot do anything to fix partisan gerrymanders, where legislatures, politicians pick their voters rather than voters picking the politicians. So they are making it harder for you to pick who actually gets to exercise political power. At the same time, they are taking away people's rights to health care. I think those are two of the more pointed and clear ways in which the court has affected our lives in monumental ways.
Yeah, last November we had a very consequential election, and people were arguing over why Kamala Harris lost. It's the eggs, it's whatever. I mean, I have a very specific opinion on that, sexism, racism. And when you look at the court, when it comes to this court, it's not a good time to be a woman, an immigrant, a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ plus community. A plus B kind of equals C here, doesn't it? It's like the one group that's not really harmed by this court is white people, white men.
Yes, and white conservative men in particular. It is stunning, I think, if you line up all of the cases. again, just going back to Scrutiny, the decision upholding the ban on gender-affirming care for minors, in that case, the Republican justices said with a straight face that a law banning gender-affirming care for transgender individuals, right, medical treatment to treat gender dysphoria, did not discriminate on the basis of gender identity, did not discriminate against trans people. Their ability to deny that there is any discrimination against LGBT people, deny that there is any discrimination against women, deny that there is any discrimination against racial minorities is truly stunning. And another kind of pointed example of their ability to invert, discrimination and equality goes back to this case from a few years ago, Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta, which was about whether a state could require some nonprofits to disclose their donors. And during the oral argument, Justice Thomas made what I thought was a really revealing question. He said, why isn't it a huge problem and a huge chill for donors to donate their money to organizations that are accused of racism and homophobia? If you pause on that, what he is saying is some speech, accusations of racism and homophobia is a problem, while other speech, the conservative donors' donations to those organizations is great and has to be protected from that other speech. And so their ability to do this in case after case reflects this just wild worldview that has the potential to do even more damage than it has already done.
Yeah. My nickname is Optimistic Andy. I try really hard to find the silver lining in these dark times. Are you surprised at all by some of the 5-4 rulings where Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett have ruled with the court's liberal justices?
No, and that's in part because I think the cases in which they have done so thus far still gave the Trump administration some of what they wanted and were not, I don't know, they didn't have that many teeth that actually restrained what the administration was doing. So, two of the 5-4 cases, one was about whether the demolition of the United States Agency for International Development was lawful. And in that case, the justices waited to release their decision. This is going to sound super technical, but they waited to release their decision until after the effective date of the lower court's order had passed. What that meant is when they eventually got around to upholding the order, the administration was not then under any obligation to immediately pay out the contracts. And that's what the administration had been asking the court for, to buy them more time and give them more flexibility for when they would actually pay out that money. And so even though formally the court rejected the Trump administration's request, in effect and in practice, they still gave them a lot of what they had asked for. So I think that those rulings are more complicated than just the bottom line outcome of ruling for or against the Trump administration necessarily conveys.
Yeah, Trump is reportedly upset with his SCOTUS justices, his nominees. In particular, Barrett, you clerked for Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was appointed by Reagan, but conservatives got pissed off at because he kind of became the swing vote with liberals on a lot of cases. Is she ruling in the model of Kennedy? Is she becoming the new Kennedy?
No, she is not. And just to go back to the most recent example, United States versus Scrutiny, in that case, the Chief Justice's majority opinion declined to say if the law had actually discriminated against trans people and singled out trans people specifically. He declined to say whether the court would have treated that kind of law as presumptively unconstitutional. Justice Barrett wrote separately to announce her view that even if the law had singled out trans people in its text and on its face, she still would treat that law as presumptively constitutional. That was completely unnecessary and gratuitous. She had already joined an opinion upholding the law. There's no need to announce. You would allow states to enact a whole bunch more discrimination. And the fact that she was with Thomas and Alito there should give you some sense of this is not someone who is moderating. This is not someone who has this, real independent streak outside of, it turns out, this one area of law that is especially salient right now, and that is whether the president gets to exercise all of the power under the sun.
Optimistic Andy is struggling right now.
Sorry.
So back in March, Roberts issued a stern and very rare rebuke of Trump over his impeachment attacks on District Court Judge James Boasberg. He's been presiding over the case of Trump invoking the Alien Enemies Act. I took this as a sign of Roberts making it clear to Trump that A, it's not Trump's court or Trump's justices, and B, that the court has no intention of handing over our democracy to him. Am I just a naive libtard?
Andy, I hate that I am pushing
My God, you're going to ruin my day, aren't you?
I guess I would say I would remind you of the context in which that statement was issued and the decisions that followed. Chief Justice Roberts said that about the president's attacks on the judge who had initially blocked the president's summary expulsions to El Salvador on a nationwide basis. And what the chief said is the remedy for decisions you don't like isn't impeachment, it's appellate review. Well, what did the Chief Justice and his Republican colleagues do with that decision on appeal? They paused it. So they gave the president what he wanted in that case. And I think that statement reads a little different in light of that. It almost signals, don't worry, we got you. And then second is, it's clear if you look at what the Supreme Court has done since then, they are not concerned about Donald Trump's erosion of the separation of powers, because after that, the Republican justices allowed him to violate a federal law that the Supreme Court had a century-old precedent saying was constitutional when the president fired the heads of multi-member commissions like the National Labor Relations Board. So they seem just fine allowing him to violate some of the federal laws that would constrain his authority. And I think the combination of the substance of their decisions and the thinness of that remark doesn't give me a ton of hope.
So
Sorry.
the remark was more about the court. It was more about them.
Yeah.
Not about us.
They have a knack of always making it about them. They have real main character energy.
What do you make of Trump's recent attack on Leonard Leo?
Oh, this is a fun one. Two things. One is, on some level, this just perfectly encapsulates the Republican Party's attitude toward the court over the last 5 decades, because we have been hearing for as long as I can remember from Republicans about how the court is too liberal, too progressive, and how Republicans needed to, do more to get their kind of appointees on the court. The Supreme Court has not had a majority of Democratic appointees for more than 5 decades. And I think what that suggests, and the Trump attacks on Leo are similar to this, is nothing is ever going to be enough for them when it comes to the Supreme Court. They will always find a way of asking for more. And, the fact that, again, some Federalist Society judges rule against Trump in a small number of cases happens to be, right, the additional problem they have identified that they want to fix. The second thing is, even if Trump somehow distanced himself from the Federalist Society, the reality is he would still be picking judges from the Federalist Society pool, because he still wants judges who don't like LGBT rights, want to attack voting rights, want to enable grift, and want to allow the mega rich to buy access to politics. Well, guess what? That pool, Federalist Society, is going to give you what you want, and you just need to identify the especially hackish loyalists in there to do the extra mile for you.
When I saw him attack Leonard Leo, I was like, no, it's like everyone eventually gets thrown under the bus.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone, no matter what they do.
I mean, look, I enjoyed it too. Let them fight. The fact that they made this bargain and then get thrown to the curb for it. It has some amusement going for it, but I just don't think it is a sign that there is something better on the other side.
No, I mean, if conservatives would make a list of like the people most responsible for giving us every damn thing we want, Leonard Leo has to be pretty much right up there at the top of that list. And to see him
Oh,
attack
yes.
Leonard Leo is astounding. The Supreme Court has about 10 days left to issue a bunch of very critical rulings. I'd like to do maybe a little lightning round kind of thing with you
Okay.
and just go through them and get a quick assessment of where you think these things might end up. The first one is birthright citizenship and nationwide injunctions.
Yes. So I think in that case, the court is likely to announce courts have to adopt particular procedures or make additional findings before they can issue nationwide injunctions, but they're unlikely to ban them entirely. I think what remains unclear and I'm not certain about is whether the Supreme Court is going to say, and we conclude those additional findings were necessarily going to be satisfied in this case, or whether it will send the cases back down to the lower courts to ask them to apply whatever new standard or use whatever new mechanism the Supreme Court suggests is necessary. And they'll say
Mhm.
nothing to affirm, I'm worried, the constitutionality of birthright citizenship.
Planned Parenthood and Medicaid access.
I think they are likely to say that individual doctors and patients cannot sue to challenge a state's exclusion of Planned Parenthood from Medicaid, and they will therefore be enabling states' efforts to defund Planned Parenthood because in that circumstance, the only other remedy would be the federal government trying to police states from doing so, and the Trump administration is certainly not going to help Planned Parenthood.
Religious opt-outs for LGBTQ plus themed books in school.
Oh, yeah. They are going to go all in on parental rights there and say parents have the right to opt their children out of instruction that the justices believe is indoctrination, which, by the way, just includes reading storybooks with LGBT characters in that case. So, yeah, they are going to recognize an opt out rule there.
Louisiana congressional map.
That one, I'm less sure. From oral argument, I kind of think that the court is going to limit states' ability to try to comply with the Voting Rights Act and ensure that Black voters are represented and can elect the candidates of their choice. But that was just my read from oral argument based in part on what the Chief Justice was saying. And sometimes he plays devil's advocate. But that's my intuition there.
And one that might really upset America's teenage boys, Texas's age verification law for porn.
This one, I'm going based on oral argument, and sometimes the justices will mislead you there, but it sounded like there was a majority to suggest courts should give more deference to state laws that, even though they restrict adults' access to constitutionally protected conduct, are designed and still operate to prevent children from accessing content that they don't have a right to, even though adults do. So I think basically they're going to allow states to adopt more anti-porn laws.
And while these cases haven't hit the court yet, there are cases. We talked about the two that were decided yesterday, and also Trump's ability to enact tariffs. Where do you think those cases are going to end up eventually?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there is at this point an infinite number of Trump policies that might make their way to the Supreme Court at some point in the future. On the tariffs, I'm really of two minds. I think if the Republican justices really believe that their made up major questions doctrine is a thing, then they should invalidate the tariffs. And I also think they might be inclined to do so in order to prevent Donald Trump from blowing up the economy even more. So maybe they invalidate them, but I don't really know. And then there's literally all of the other policies that I don't know when they're going to make their way to the court or in what posture. And so it's just really difficult to say what might happen.
You're a law professor, and so I'm curious to know, in terms of students' reaction, what their reaction is to the assault by this administration on major law firms. Like, is it
Yeah.
inspiring to them? Does it make them want to be a bigger, better, more powerful lawyer? Is it like, oh my God, why am I becoming a lawyer? I'm only going to get attacked one day. Like, where do they stand on what they've been seeing and hearing out of this administration?
I always hesitate to generalize what students as a group are feeling or thinking. But I think the honest answer would be it runs the gamut. For some students who came to law school envisioning themselves as civil rights lawyers who are always going to be fighting a tough fight, this is not unexpected. And so they think like, yeah, I was always going to have to fight and fight for people's ability to obtain representation. This is just part of that pattern. For people who came to law school thinking, I don't really I'm not thinking of myself as going into politics or doing civil rights. I just want to keep my head down and like maybe make some money. I think this has been a rude wake-up call as far as you can't zone out or check out from what's happening in politics because at some point it's going to come around and affect you. And then, there's also people who kind of are sympathetic to what the administration is doing and think, it's time for the government to come after these law firms, which, apparently tried to signal some support for rights by having Pride months or DEI policies. And that was just too much.
And, one of the things I've been thinking about lately, because it's hard not to, is that, we have hundreds of cases. There are so many cases and injunctions and motions and appeals and filings and hearings. And maybe it's more of a rhetorical question than anything else, but do you have any sense of how much money is being spent on all of this? Like, it has to be mind-numbing.
I mean, it's so much money on both sides. The idea
Yes.
that American taxpayers are footing the bill for the military parade or the Trump administration, shuttling people around and between Guantanamo Bay and then back to the United States and then some to El Salvador and like back to the United States just should be appalling. And that we are funding the defense of these autocratic, wildly illegal policies is also gross. And then the fact that the administration is imposing these costs on these major civic institutions from universities to media to law firms. That should also be concerning because he is draining them and making it more difficult for them to fight back on behalf of other individuals and entities that are being attacked by the administration as well.
My last question has nothing to do with law or politics. It's a window into the soul question. The best way to get a window into one's soul is often through music. So give me your top
Ooh.
5 musical artists of all time.
Taylor Swift, Taylor's version, Taylor Swift original versions, Taylor Swift Red Era. No, I'm kidding. But definitely Taylor Swift at the number 1 spot. Number 2, I would probably say Charlie, the Brat album. I absolutely love right now. 3rd, Ariana Grande. I loved Eternal Sunshine, the deluxe edition. 4, Beyonce. I'm going to Cowboy Carter, and I cannot wait. And 5, Red Hot Chili Peppers.
What do you think of, I think it's the Grammys. They just decided to split the country music category into 2, the original country music versus new country music. I wonder what that's all about.
It's so lame. I think it is obviously partially a pushback to one Beyonce Cowboy Carter being excluded from the, CMA and other awards and then taking home a Grammy for Best Album.
I'm not going to disagree. The book is Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. It's a terrific book. Go buy it. Leah, thanks for coming on and chatting with us. Very insightful. And do come back again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And definitely.
All righty. Take care.